That Nigel Farage, the leader of UKIP, joins us now live from Belgium. Hi, Nigel.
Good morning.
Thank you very much indeed for coming on. Let's start with the sugar tax. What do you make of that?
I'm sick to death. I'm being taxed to hell. Do you know, the packet of fags I've got in front of me here, they've gone up by 21p. They're 10 quid a packet. My gin and tonic is now, that I pour at home, I'm going to pay more tax on as a result of the sugar tax. And there's no evidence whatsoever that a sugar tax will reduce consumption of sweet drinks. The only thing that'll get kids perhaps drinking fewer tins or whatever it is education, that it'll make them fat. So I'm sick to death of being taxed on everything that moves.
Well, you say your fags are now 10 quid a packet. Hasn't that helped to reduce the amount of packets that are being sold?
Well, do you know what? I'm in Brussels today. I've come over for the Turkey Summit, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
And this packet of cigarettes that is 10 quid now in the UK is €6 here, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to load my suitcase up with carton after carton of fags that are costing about £4.40 a packet. And you know what? The UK revenue will get nothing out of me at all. And that's the point. And that's the point. If you overtax tobacco, people just go to the black market.
Okay, let's move on from there then, Nigel, if we can. If you had been in charge yesterday, what would have been the centrepiece of your budget?
I would have apologised. I would have said, I'm very sorry, but I became the Chancellor in 2010, and I promised you we would get rid of the annual budget deficit. However, I'm ashamed to say that the national debt, the total national debt, when I took over, was 650 billion. It is now over 1.5 trillion. I have failed completely and utterly, and into the bargain, I'm telling you today that growth in the UK is running at 2%. And the reason it's running at 2% is half of that growth is because of open door immigration. More people in the country means a higher turnover. And the rest of it is because we're living on tick. I would have owned up to the British public that I've failed completely, but no such thing.
We've just had our wealth manager on and our podcaster, Jonathan Davis. He says the fundamental mistake was bailing out the banks. They should have let a couple of those banks go to the wall. They should have acted in a real capitalist manner. Do you agree with that?
Oh, they weren't allowed to. They couldn't do that because the European Union, and if you remember, back at the time, the governor of the Bank of England saying that from the moment of Northern Rock, he didn't quite know what to do because he had to wait for his instructions from Brussels. Precisely. And I do agree with Jonathan Davis. I do think the whole point of capitalism is you take risk, and if it goes wrong, you go bust.
Jonathan makes the point that we, the little people, are paying for the mistakes of the bankers and the big corporations, and that Osborne's just perpetuating it with this, and the sugar tax is just another example of that. You probably agree with that as well, I guess.
Well, I think the sugar tax is not quite as relevant, but I mean, the fact is, the very banks that we bailed out, right, are the same banks that are now funding the campaign to keep us part of the European Union, where the original instruction came from. And my advice to people is don't listen to what Goldman Sachs have to say, don't listen to what JP Morgan have to say. They and government have now become as one.
Okay, and quantitative easing, a major mistake?
I do understand initially why it was done. But the trouble is, it's now become a drug addiction.
Okay.
And yeah, it's gone way too far.
Okay, I want to go on to Turkey in a moment, but we've got loads and loads of listeners in Spain, lots of expats, Nigel, and I've got one question from them, and they want you to answer it. Good morning, John. I hope that Nigel Farage can give a clear answer to all his expats who have retired and are living in the EU. An article in the Costa Blanca News reported that it would be the end of life as we knew it in Spain if the UK opted to leave the EU. So 2 questions, Nigel. 1, in the event of an outvote, is it true that expats who have retired to Spain will lose their rights to receive the European Economic Area, EEA, Reciprocal Healthcare Agreement, the RHCA?
Right, look, what you've been told, what the expat community have been told, just as the farmers and others have been told, is this amazing scare story that's gone around for the last 3 weeks. Sort of the idea that an expat in Spain will be branded, put onto a train and sent back to England. It is complete baloney. There are about 400, maybe 450,000 Brits living in Spain on a full-time basis. When they go and when they need health care, what happens is the British government picks up the bill, right? Now, the British government will pick up that bill if they'd stayed in the United Kingdom, and these are nearly all retirees who've paid into the system for all of their lives. Nothing will change from the British government perspective, and from the Spanish perspective. If the Brits up sticks and moved out, well, frankly, the whole of the Costa del Sol will go bust.
Because a lot of these expats, of course, if they've only been living there for less than 15 years, have a vote. So their vote could be really important. He also asks, will fiscal rights be eliminated for EU residents who have retired to the European Economic Area?
Well, ultimately, we will not be part of the European Economic Area. But the idea that the British government would renege on pensions that it owes people, frankly, is ludicrous. It would cause uproar in Westminster if anyone even suggested that.
OK, now let's talk about this meeting that you're at today, the migrant crisis. Here's the headline for the BBC: many issues in way of EU-Turkey deal. Could you talk to us about that, please?
Yeah, I mean, because the first thing to bear in mind, John, is the reason that we're having the referendum on June the 23rd and not September the 23rd is that what Cameron knows is if the migrant crisis was bad last year, you probably ain't seen nothing yet. So the situation with Turkey is this. Mrs. Merkel, who, and when you hear that name, you should all bow because she is, after all, now our leader, our leaderine. Mrs. Merkel has proposed a deal with Turkey. And here's how it goes. For every person that comes into the Greek islands that would not qualify as a refugee, for every one of those that we send back to Turkey, they will in return send us one person who's come from Syria. From June of this year, Mrs. Merkel proposes that Turkey, 77 million Turks, have visa-free access to the Schengen zone of the European Union. Oh, and we're going to pay them 6 billion euros to look after the refugees from Syria that are in their camps. And on top of all of it, what Mrs. Merkel wants to do is to fast-track Turkish accession to be a member state of the European Union. And if you think the Turks have got Mrs. Merkel and the rest of the EU over a barrel, you'd be right. Yeah. And what a pity that David Cameron didn't choose to have a Turk as his negotiator for the British deal.
They're holding us to ransom, aren't they?
They're blackmailing us, basically. Yeah, they're blackmailing us. What they're saying is, give us shed loads of money, give us visa-free access, give us membership of the European Union, or we will send you countless millions of people. OK,
so what should we be saying? Or does it all just come down to, on the 23rd, we've got to get out of this super state?
Well, I was saying, John, last April, when Mr. Juncker, the Commission President, put into place the EU's common asylum policy, I was saying he'd set the bounds so wide that it would inevitably mean that millions of people would come. There is nobody in this building, apart from me, who thinks that policy should be reversed. And so from a British perspective, if we want to protect ourselves against massively increased rates of immigration and, dare I say, when the boss of Europol, the European Police Force, says he now believes there are 3,000 to 5,000 jihadi terrorists that have got into Europe using the migrant route. Remember, listeners, within 4 or 5 years, they will all have EU passports and they will all be able to come to Britain. This referendum is the only chance you will ever get in your life for us to take back not just control of our laws, but our borders. And if we do that, we'll make Britain a safer place.
How would you solve the Syrian problem? Putin now is withdrawn. What would you do?
Oh, I mean, how one solves...
Because that's what we have to solve, isn't it? To stop the migrant problem, to stop the jungle.
How we solve, a massive civil war that's been going on for 5 years with hundreds of thousands of dead is a very difficult question to answer. I have to say, to be honest, John, I feel that we are pretty guilty of destabilizing the whole region. We haven't made Iraq any better, and the bombing of Libya was utterly insane. And we're told perhaps another 500,000 want to come from Libya to Europe this year as well. But what I do know is this. When Australia, back in 2008-9, faced very large migrant waves coming to Australia by boat. The Aussies said, I'm sorry, but anyone that comes by this route will not be given refugee status. And you know what? The international community condemned them, but the boats stopped coming. And the only way this can be dealt with sensibly, and I don't mind actually giving money to Turkey, giving money to Lebanon to help with displaced people. I haven't got a problem with doing that. But until the message gets sent that the only refugees that can come to Europe will be genuine refugees who've been security checked, who we can make sure are not Islamic fighters, and we process those applications, not in Europe, but offshore. Until we go down that route, nothing will change.
And before you go, Nigel, I've got one question from a listener. He says, I'm a UKIP voter, a massive fan of Nigel, but please, please, please ask him, is there any way you can unite all of the out factions together? As united we stand, divided we fall. Please lead the out campaign. The UK needs you, Nigel. How do you answer Steve's request?
Steve, I have done my utmost to bring the two competing camps together in meeting after meeting after meeting, but one of those groups refuses to work with anybody else. So do you know what? Let's not worry about it. Let's get on with it. And I promise you, Steve, that I will be absolutely at the forefront of the People's Army. And I won't be campaigning in SW1 in Westminster. I'll be out all around the country. I was in Peterborough last night. I've got 1,000 people coming to Bath tomorrow night. We had 500 street stalls out last Saturday. And what UKIP will provide are the volunteers on the ground to go out and have millions of conversations with ordinary people. And I will lead that campaign.
Richard says, thank you, Mr. F, for not just fighting this battle, but starting it. UKIP created this opportunity, says Richard Walker. And Nigel, do you believe we're going to get out?
Yes, I do, actually. I think the dawning realization that the migrant crisis is going to engulf Europe, is fundamentally changing countries like Sweden and Germany in a negative way. And I think the Brits will say, do you know what? This is a mess. It's not working. Let's take back control.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.